Well, the Philippines is a group of islands, some 7,000 islands, and it was discovered by Magellan and was a possession of Spain for 400 years. And they brought culture, they brought religion, they brought education for many, many years. And they were landowners, and they brought businesses there until the 1800s, when the Filipinos decided they wanted their independence from Spain. And so the Spanish-American War came and drove the Spaniards out, and they brought their American culture into the Philippines for, I say, about 70 years. And then came the Japanese occupation, which lasted about 3 or 4 years, and the liberation. And in 1946, the United States gave the Philippines their independence. And so they have been independent since then. It's mostly a Catholic country, although there's a lot of other denominations today. And there's some, maybe 100 million people today. The climate is the tropics, islands, and beaches. The island I was born in was only about 150 miles long and 50 miles wide. And we'd go from one island to the other on little motorboats. And of course, the big island of Luzon is where the capital is, Manila. And I have family in both Luzon and 2 different islands in the south. And they're still there. I never met my grandfather from Spain. His name was Narciso Lopez Manzano. He came to the Philippines and started a business. In fact, it was a cigar business called Tabacalera. And he met a little Filipino woman, my grandmother, whose name was Josefa Samson. She was quite young when he passed away. And they had 7 children, of which my mother was the youngest. But I knew my little grandmother. She was about 5 foot tall, and we called her Lola Pepay for Josefa, was a nickname. And she was very tiny, and she wore the native dress, a loose dress with a long skirt, and she wore her hair pulled back in a bun, and she was a very, very sweet little lady. Very timid, very quiet, because apparently her husband, Spanish grandfather, was a very tall, strong, outspoken man. She didn't speak a word of English, and we'd make her read something in English, and we would laugh at the way she was pronouncing words. She was the real grandmother. Well, she was just there when we needed her, and there to cook for us and fix meals for us. That was her big pleasure. And she and my mother kind of bossed her around, because my mother knew how to run a house, and Lola was just in the kitchen or with us in our bedroom. And Lola Pepay lived with us, lived with several of her children, and she stayed with us during the war and stayed with my other cousin, and she died during occupation. Edward Dennison Taylor from, I think, Memphis, Tennessee. He's our mysterious grandfather. And he came as a volunteer for the Spanish-American War. What is interesting about him is that we know nothing about him. Don't know anything about his family. All we know is that he was in the military and was discharged in the Philippines and lived there. He married this 15-year-old little Filipino girl. She was very pretty and very vivacious, by the name of Petra Alferez. And we called her, Lola Petra. And she didn't speak any English. She was strictly a Filipino woman, very talkative, talked in the native dialect. And in fact, it kind of irritated my mother that she's speaking. Our dialect in Cebu is Cebuano. So in Manila, you talk Tagalog. So each of these islands had different dialects. So she would always talk in the dialect, and we'd talk in the dialect with her. And her English was quite broken. So she was a very simple, not very educated, but a very happy person. He started a business in the island of Cebu. And I believe it may have been in the shoe business, shoes. And I may have also heard that he started liquor business. Maybe he was a bootlegger, I don't know. But anyway, I don't know much about him because he died at the age of 42, I believe, leaving 7 children, of which my father was the oldest. And Lola Petra struggled raising these children. She was a wonderful cook, and she did catering. And she looked to my father for a lot of help with the children. And he helped educate them. And what happened to her, I think after a few years, she remarried a Filipino and had a daughter. My dad's name was Eduardo. His father was Edward Taylor. He was Eduardo Alferez Taylor. And he was a very bright young man. He had graduated from the University of the Philippines, chemical engineering. And he went to work for an American company called APO Cement Company. And so he became the chemist of this cement plant, which was located in Cebu. And he loved his job. He loved the country. So at a young age, he opted to become a Filipino citizen. All his brothers and sisters remained Americans. But he was also very involved with the government. He was quite well known, and he was, I would say, the expert on the cement business, which was a very big business at that time. And that cement company, which used to be owned by an American company, then became the property of the Philippine government. And I remember growing up meeting with Harold Power and his wife, who were the general managers from the United States of the cement plant. And I must have been, and my dad was the chemist, and he went up the ranks. And I remember, I think I must have been about 10 years old when we heard that Harold Power committed suicide. So from that time on, my dad became the general manager of the Cebu cement plant. So my dad made that plant very successful, and he had a lot of connections with the United States because they would have ships bring gypsum or whatever raw materials that they needed. And he eventually resigned from the government cement plant and with some businessmen started their own Republic Cement Company. But he was a very kind person, very smart, and loved people, and did very well in his life, was a very successful man. My mother's name is Soledad Manzano Taylor. Soledad was her name, and her nickname was Choling. So everybody called her Choling. And of course we called her Mama. Let's see, my mom, I think, was born in 1904. And she was the youngest of her family. And she was quite young when her father died. And her father, who was a businessman, had sent all his older children to college in Spain. So by the time my mother was born, he was no longer there, and she was never educated abroad. And her older sisters were kind of upper crust Spanish. They'd been educated in Spain, so they kind of lorded it over her. Although she did go to college, she graduated as valedictorian of her class, and she was a concert pianist. And she and my dad got married at a very young age. I don't know much about their courtship other than seeing pictures. And all I know is that they were living in Manila, which was really the place to live, the capital of the islands. He and my mother apparently eloped when they were 19 and 20. She was ready to do her piano concert because she was quite a pianist. And for some reason they eloped, I don't know. Then they have a wedding after that. That was in 1924. She and my dad then, when they got married, moved to the island of Cebu, where the rest of the family stayed in Manila. All her brothers and sisters. All the Manzanos stayed in Manila. And she was a very intelligent woman, and she really was a partner to my dad in his being successful in his business. She had a great personality, and people really looked up to her. And she was an organizer. And she organized the women's club, and she organized the, it's like a thrift shop to make money for the poor people. When we had Christmas at home, she would buy the toys or whatever the people needed. Here she had hundreds of families that looked up to her, the employees. And on Christmas, she would have them all come over to our house, and they'd line up, and we would give the presents to the children and to the families. And she ran the show, and she was very good at it. In Cebu, she was quite well known, and she and my dad were outstanding citizens in this island of Cebu, which had about 1 million people. My name is Consuelo Manzano Taylor Wilson. Nobody calls me Consuelo. My mom and dad gave all their children a Spanish name and an American name. So the nickname for Consuelo was Connie. In fact, they say Connie, not Connie, but here it's Connie. Consuelo means hope, and Manzano was a Spanish name for, I believe they had apple orchards in Spain, and manzana is an apple. All my brothers and sisters have the middle name of Manzano because that's our mother's name. So you always keep your mother's name and your father's name, which I did with my children because I'm a Taylor, and so all their middle names are Taylor. I'm the oldest of 9, and then came my brother, and they named him Eduardo after my dad, and he was just a year younger than I. And his nickname is Danding. And then came my sister, and her name was Teresita Manzano Taylor, and we called her Tess. She's the only one of my siblings that are gone, and she and I were very close. And then came my brother, Ricardo, and we call him Dick, and he lives in San Francisco. And then came Juan, and we call him John. And John is still in Cebu, married, has children, is very ill with Parkinson's. After John came Isabel. She's a widow now. She lives in Hong Kong and is a very well-known reporter, television commentator. That's Betty. And then comes Victor, who was born during occupation. He's in Manila, and we call him Wahoo, because he looked like a little Indian baby when he was born. And then I have my youngest sister, is Cecilia Manzano Taylor Hoffman. She married a German and lived in Switzerland for many years. But she now lives back in the Philippines, doing a lot for the women in the Philippines. And we call her Guti. That's her nickname. And youngest is Carlos Manzano Taylor, who is younger than my 2 daughters. My mother sent him to me when he was a junior in high school. I've kind of raised him. And he became an American citizen, and he's a minister in Daly City, California. So we had a very happy childhood in this little town of Tinaan. And it was a small town that had the cement plant and not much else. So my dad would build houses for the employees. And my mother started the school and started the church, and we had the run of the town. Everybody knew us. We had fun. We did swimming parties and parties at home and birthday parties, and we did some traveling throughout the islands. And one of my friend's father was a captain of a ship that traveled from one island to the other, and we would enjoy that. But I must stay with my mother. She had her rules, and we had to abide by her rules. So it was very formal, very strict. It's like sitting in the dining room table for meals. I mean, you'd have to be dressed and sit, and my mother would have, she had either a bell or a bell on her foot, where she would ring once, and the maids were to bring the entrees and serve it on the left of each person, and twice would mean to remove the plates, and they had to take it off from the right side. And this was the ritual. Had to be this way. How were we with our elders, with our parents? we had rules that when you came in the house, you would acknowledge the parents and let them converse with you. When we'd visit our grandparents or visited our relatives, the first thing you always must do is acknowledge the grandmother with a kiss on her hand or on her cheeks, and greet every adult that was in the room. And they would then talk to you and ask you questions. And, but you were very aware of grown-ups and very respectful. And I was always afraid to talk to them until they talked to me. Since we didn't know any better, this was a happy time. We knew our parents loved us, took care of us, gave us the best of what they could give. My mother hired people to take care of us. See, there are a lot of poor people who want to come and have a job and live with you. So they lived with us. We had a woman who did the cooking. She never learned how to drive. She had a driver. She had a woman who did the wash. And of course, they did the wash by hand. And the gardener. So when there were 2 children, there were 2 maids. When there were 5 maids looking after the kids. There was one thing about Mom, is that we were never good enough. I mean, you can do better. And I said, Mom, your 9 children are wonderful. None of them is in jail. I mean, they're all successful. We knew she loved us, and she wanted the best for us. And she knew what was the best for us, whether we liked it or not. What I remember is going to school at 4 years old and going to live in the convent. The name of the convent that I went to was St. Catherine's School, and it was in the southern part of Cebu, and it was run by Belgian sisters who had come to the Philippines as young women, 20 and 21 years old, teachers. There must have been maybe 100, 200, 300 students from first grade to high school. And of course, we all wore uniforms, and we were all lived in the dormitory. And we'd be in school from June to December, come home for Christmas, and go back to school in January till March or April, because April and May were the hottest months there, so that was vacation. But anyway, it was kind of hard as a child to live in a convent, but I had all these other students there who were going through the same thing. And we were really cared for. We had our bed and our chest of drawers, a bed and a chest of drawers in the big dorm, according to ages. And then the nuns there would be 2 nuns in charge of this floor. And they just run the school from morning through night. And we'd line up to go to the dormitory and to go to bed at a certain time, and we lined up to go to the refectory, which was the dining room. And it's just like you see in the movies today, everybody stands up, says their prayers, you sit down, you eat your meals, you finish, you stand up and you line up and leave the room. But you did have a playtime, so they'd let you out but it was the best education I could have had. I was in the convent for my grade school, maybe kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. And then my mother decided that we would go to another school in the city, which was St. Teresa's College School, and the boys would go to San Carlos School. So then she had our driver drive us to school, drop us off, and drop the boys off in their school, and come home. St. Teresa's was a big school, and it was run by the same order of nuns from Belgium and some local teachers, and it was run by the Franciscan order, a strict school, and all girls, no communication with boys. And we had tennis, and we had touch ball, and we had baseball, very much into sports and the usual curriculum for school. And of course we wore uniforms. We did have a 50th reunion in '91, and my friend made uniforms, the same uniforms that we used all through high school, so that was a very nice thing. I graduated in 1941, in May of '41. And my dad was transferred to the main office in the big city of Manila as the general manager of the cement plant. And so we made the change, which was quite a change because we had lived in Cebu all of our lives, and here we come to the big city of Manila. It's like going to New York City. And in fact, my cousins in Manila called me the country bumpkin. So we moved to Manila in June and moved the whole family there. And my dad bought a fairly big house because there were then 6 children. And of course we brought all our people who worked for us, our servants, who had lived with us for many years. They came with us to Manila. And we lived in the city of Manila. And I had then graduated and started college. So it was quite exciting and a new life. I remember waking up maybe in the middle of the night, or it was dark, and my dad got up and I followed him outside. And we looked at the planes bombing, and I didn't realize what was going on, and he did. And from then on, life was completely changed. And it was not maybe 5 or 6 months later that we heard in the news that Manila was declared an open city. There would be no fighting, and that MacArthur would leave and go to Australia. And I'm sure it must have been terrible for the American soldiers who were left there. And MacArthur left General Wainwright to stay with whatever military there was there. The day that the Japanese were walking into the city of Manila, my dad, of course, told us everyone stayed in the house. Nobody wanted to be out, especially young girls. And my dad had gone to the office in the car with the driver. And what happened was that the businesses in the city of Manila opened their doors and told the people, come in and get what you want. They did not want the Japanese to come in and take over. So what happened was that it was mass looting. Everybody just went in, took what they could, went home. Our driver came home with, he had been to a department store and had bolts and bolts of material. And I don't know what else he had. Gone to the grocery store and got cans of whatever and took it home. And so that's what we lived with there for a while, not knowing what to do until the Japanese came in, took over, set up a puppet government, and the puppet president was Laurel. His name was Laurel, and he had to do what the Japanese had asked him to do. So it was broadcasted that we were all going to be brothers in Asia. They called it the co-prosperity sphere. They asked everyone to go about their business. They asked my dad to run his business the way he always did, but there were always Japanese overlooking whatever they did. Schools opened, and Japanese teachers came in. And the first thing the Japanese government did was asked everyone to turn in their radios so we wouldn't listen to any other station. Turn in all their firearms or guns or whatever they had. So they came to every home and collected radios. My father happened to have a small radio, and he had kept it behind a filing cabinet. So we kept that one. My brother and I, we were teenagers. At night we would listen to that little radio and listen to the Voice of America.
Ladies and gentlemen, how do you do? This is William Winter with an analysis of today's news. There's good news in the Pacific today. And there's good news from Europe, too. In fact, the information that comes to us over the wires this afternoon is just about the best we've received in some days. For one thing, we are told that General MacArthur has given the Japanese a whipping in Luzon.
And we would take it up in shorthand. And we would type it up and spread it around the neighborhood. Just spread news, whatever news we had, what was going on. They took our cars. So we used our bicycles to go to school or walked. And my dad eventually got the horse and buggy. The Japanese gathered all the Americans, and our neighbor was an American family, and took them to this big university called Santo Tomas University. And that's where they lived for 3 long years. And at first we could go and visit them and take some food or take whatever they had left at home. But then after a few months, they discontinued that and we could no longer go and see them. As the months went on, the Japanese came over, officer, and looked over our house and said, "We want this house." So move out in 2 weeks. So my mother looked for a house, and we rented a small place and left the house. And we went on with school. I took a secretarial course and took Japanese language. And my dad had to go back to Cebu and keep that plant going. In the meantime, my mother had another baby, my occupation brother. And we kept on. All the bolts of materials and all the groceries we would barter with neighbors who maybe got something else, and we would barter whatever we had. And on every corner of a main street would be a Japanese sentry. You'd have to pass by and bow and go on. The worst thing is that when they wanted you to do something, they talked in Japanese and nobody understood them. We didn't know what they wanted. But, they kept you afraid to overstep. Well, Dunding and I were always running around doing this thing, telling people what we heard and writing it in the newspaper. And we'd go to school, because then we went to school together. And we had no longer bicycles that would work, and we walked to school. And we would usually go through a sentry, and we knew the sentry. And I guess, I don't know what Dundee was doing, but they decided that they would look through my bag and see what he was doing. I don't remember if anybody else was with us. There were other kids with us. And he sat back and took my umbrella and opened it up, and he had taken this gun, small pistol, not very big, and put it up on the prongs of the opened umbrella and walked in, just like that. Looked at the Japanese sentry like, what do you want? Hate you. And we went through that. And I was so angry at him because the Japanese were so mean. And the least punishment that, if you did not do something, the least punishment that they'd give, they slap you on both sides of your face. That was nothing. Our neighbor, Antonio Escoda, was a newspaperman, and his wife was very involved in the Girl Scouts and, women's organizations. Josefa Llanes Escoda was her name. And she wanted to help the Americans who were imprisoned after the death march. And they were about 2-3 hours away from Manila. So she would organize us young teenagers and prepare a program to go and entertain those prisoners and the Japanese in Cabanatuan. We only did this one time. We had a dance program. As we went to this prison camp and saw just Americans sitting there, so sad to see them. And they were all sitting there to watch our program. We had singing and dancing. In the meantime, the older girls went around visiting the Americans and tried to get their letters or whatever to send home. And we came home. And the next thing we knew, Mr. and Mrs. Escoda are gone. Her daughter was my age, and her son was younger. So apparently they went to Fort Santiago, which was the place where people were tortured and killed. And apparently she was in a room the size of a closet with a lot of women, but we never saw them again. One day the Japanese came and took my dad. They kept him for about a week and sent him home. And apparently some of his friends had done some underground work communicating with, there were some Americans who were not captured by Japanese, and they lived out in the outskirts. The guerrillas, we call them, the guerrillas. So apparently they found that he did not communicate with them, but his other friends were tortured, nails taken, ears cut off, things like that, just horrible. However, I have to say that we were teenagers and we still had to get together. And we would walk for miles to get together at somebody's house and have a party. Or we would go to a friend's house who had a tennis court and play tennis. We were still having fun, but we were always aware of our behavior or never knowing what the Japanese would come up with. A couple of years had gone by, and my dad and my mother had talked about leaving the city because my dad said, I don't think we should stay here. She had a brother. My uncle owned a coconut plantation in Batangas, which was, maybe 6 or 7 hours away from Manila. He said, I think we should go. And at that time, I was very much involved in riding my bicycle and working at a clinic. People were starving, not enough food. They had tropical ulcers, and I would work with the doctors taking care of these sick. And I said, no, I want to stay right here where all the action is going to be. And my dad says, if you don't go, we won't go. And if anything happens, it's because you didn't want to go. So after a while, he decided to leave. He hired a truck, a big truck, to take us to Batangas. We loaded that truck, not only my mother, 5 children, 4 maids, the driver, who was taking care of our horses, and Mom's grand piano had to go. And we loaded up that truck one evening and left. That same night, the bombing started. The Americans were on their way back. We were on the highway, stopped, everybody got under the truck until everything was quiet, and we kept on going and ended up at my uncle's farm. And we had a small hut that we lived in, no bathrooms. But we were away from the city, which was really our salvation for our family. And we lived there for a few months. In the meantime, my dad and my brother were in the guerrilla forces, and they were meeting with other people who were in communication with MacArthur, knowing that he eventually was coming back. In fact, my dad and my brother and 3 other men had left to meet with another guerrilla force, and they were caught by the Japanese, and 2 of them were shot. And my brother will never forget that. He must have been 14 years old. And so anyway, they let them go, and I don't know what the complete story was. And they eventually came back home. And my friend was a doctor, so I would get supplies from him, and I would go from one little hut to the other and take care of people. And I remember there had been fighting going on, and they called me to come and see this man, and his neck had been cut off back here. And, at 16 years old, and the poor people just don't know what to do. So anyway, I went through that, and I was very brave, and I thought I was a good doctor. And so I took care of him and washed his wounds and stitched it and went on. I was very excited doing what I was doing. And people would have, it's like a leprosy, the ulcers that hit your leg and eat the skin, and it's just completely gone. So anyway, this went on for a few months, and the next thing we hear is that the 11th Airborne had landed in Lingayen Gulf, which was north. And they landed not far from Batangas, where we were, in a town called Nasugbu. And so we all started going towards this town. And of course the Japanese then started to scatter, knowing that they were coming. And I can remember, and you've seen it on television, the soldiers coming through the little village and the people, waving at them. And that's how I first met the 11th Airborne guys. And right there, the fighting was going on, and they started the hospital, the tents, and I went to work for them. The one thing that I'll never forget, the sight, is when I was working in that hospital, and they took over the school for, to place their wounded. It's just walking by and seeing all these young American boys, so far from home, so wounded, in a country they never even heard of, just laying there. What happened was that the Americans had come in from every side of Manila City. And so the Japanese were concentrated right there, nowhere to go. And they went crazy. My friends, who lived in a part of the town, had all gotten together in a church, huddled together. The Japanese came in and just killed everyone. Women, children, they didn't care. They had nowhere to go, the Japanese. And they were of the belief that if they killed, they'd go to heaven. Or killed for their emperor, who was their god. People, families, were killing themselves, fathers, mothers, cutting their wrists in order not to be killed by Japanese. In the meantime, the Americans came in. First thing they did was go to Santo Tomas and get those Americans out of there. They'd been there 3.5 years.
At Santo Tomas prison in Manila, a surprise visit by General MacArthur marks the greatest mass liberation of civilians in the Pacific. 3,700 internees, mostly British and American citizens, are freed.
And so that was their main target. And of course the rest of it was trying to get Manila liberated. So by that time we were the Americans. I had my first can of peaches. I can remember that soldier giving me a can of peaches. And so we had befriended these Americans, and my dad said, could we ride in with you to Manila when the fighting was really almost over? And try to find our house, and we did. We went in the command car, my dad, my brother, and I. And we went into Manila. It was liberated. It was destroyed. The Americans were everywhere. The Japanese were gone. We went to our house, and all we found were the walls. All the faucets, the tubs, anything sticking out was gone. It was destroyed. So we went back to get the rest of the family and come back, and when we did, to my surprise, they used the house for barracks for American soldiers. And there was a house full of soldiers, and they gave us the servants' quarters in the back to live, which was wonderful. And I'm here, I am 18 years old, and a lot of blue-eyed blonde boys. So that was a happy time. My dad had to go through a lot of paperwork to prove that that was our home and it was taken away from us. The Americans were doing that for everyone. We couldn't live in that house because it was destroyed and had to be fixed. We decided to go back to Cebu, where the cement plant was, and live there for a while, which is what we did. I was all of 19, 20. I heard about the airline starting, and they were going to come and interview some people in Cebu, some young girls, and some young girls in Manila. And 4 or 5 of my friends, we said, let's do this. So maybe we'll see what the rest of the world is like. And my dad thought, no, you're not going to do that. So we talked about it, and I said, well, let me just apply and see what they think. And it was TWA that had come in there to help Philippine Airlines get started. And 2 of my friends, we were accepted. And so this was a big move. And I asked my dad, let me do this and let me travel and see what it's like. And he let me. And my mother thought it was okay. So my friend and I went to Manila because then we started our training. And of course my mother said, what kind of training are you doing? You know, we're going in the airplane, go to wherever they're going, inter-island. First it was going to be inter-island, from one island to the other, and serve people their drinks and their food. Is that what you want to do? I said, yeah, that's what I want to do. Just to see something else. So we did. I got accepted in February. The airline just started in January. So we were one of the first ones. And we did the inter-island flights, which was exciting, but it was hard. It was DC-3s, bucket seats, bucket seats. And you'd have 25 to 30 passengers, and you'd hop from one island to the other. Bad weather, you'd be so sick. I'd go back and throw up and come back and help somebody else throwing up. So anyway, it was a tough job. And then in November, they decided to go overseas. San Francisco, Tokyo, Hong Kong. And because we were one of the first stewardesses, we got on one of the first flights. So that was exciting. And, our planes were not as fast as they are now, so it took us a long time to get from Manila to Honolulu. We'd have to stop in Guam, we'd have to stop in Wake Island, we'd have to go to Honolulu, change crew, and then go to San Francisco. So that first trip was the most exciting thing I'd ever done. And I'd never been out of the little island of Cebu in Manila. So that was really exciting. And we'd make that trip, have off, and go to Tokyo, go to Hong Kong. And I did that for about a year. And Charlie came to work in June for the company. And I remember coming home from a flight, going into the office and seeing this pilot's there and Charlie there. And he said, now that's the woman I love. And I looked, and I had never seen him before. And so he was considered the clown. He was always clowning. So anyway, that's how it happened. And a year later we were married, and I was out of a job. I had a new job.